The cold rain of Seattle has a way of washing away illusions, but it never quite managed to wash away the heavy, suffocating burden of family guilt for Ethan. You see, growing up in the rusted heartland of Ohio, the rules of the American dream were drilled into his head with relentless, almost military precision. Work hard, keep your head down, pay your taxes, and maybe, just maybe, you get to carve out a little slice of security in a world that is inherently designed to eat you alive. Ethan played by the rules. He was the quiet kid, the one who stayed up late writing code while the rest of the neighborhood boys were out throwing back cheap beers and chasing high school glory. He took the massive student loans, moved to the Pacific Northwest, and locked himself into the grueling, fluorescent-lit grind of the tech industry. He was building a fortress of financial stability, brick by brick, dollar by dollar. But fortresses are only good against enemies on the outside. They do absolutely nothing when the threat holds the key to the front door and shares your last name. Richard was the exact opposite of Ethan. If Ethan was the solid, unmoving foundation, Richard was the flashy neon sign on the roof. 6 years older, blessed with the kind of aggressive charisma that Silicon Valley venture capitalists absolutely devour, Richard was the golden boy. He had the sharp jawline, the tailored suits, and the terrifying ability to look a man dead in the eye and sell him an empty box. Back in Ohio, their mother Margaret treated Richard like the second coming of Christ. Every Thanksgiving dinner was a shrine to Richard's latest, slightly exaggerated triumph. Ethan would sit quietly at the end of the table, cutting his turkey, listening to his mother parade Richard's accomplishments around like a show dog to anyone who would listen. It is a very specific type of psychological warfare, the golden child and scapegoat dynamic. It conditions the younger, less flashy sibling to believe that their only real value in the family unit is to serve as a safety net, a quiet enabler for the star of the show. And that is exactly what happened when the shiny veneer of Richard's life violently cracked. It was a Tuesday night in late November when the reality of American corporate brutality finally caught up with Richard. His logistics tech startup down in Austin, Texas, had bled through 3 rounds of funding. The investors pulled the plug. The bank accounts were frozen by the IRS due to unpaid payroll taxes. The leased Tesla was repossessed right out of his driveway. Richard showed up at Ethan's modest apartment in Capitol Hill smelling of stale scotch, cheap airport coffee, and pure desperation. I want you to picture this. A man who spent his entire adult life projecting the image of a titan of industry, now sitting on a cheap fiberboard sofa, weeping into his hands, begging his little brother for salvation. The pitch was masterful. It was laced with the kind of emotional manipulation that only family can inflict. Richard did not just ask for a business loan. He weaponized their shared history. He talked about legacy, about blood being thicker than water, about how this was merely a temporary setback and he just needed a bridge loan to secure a massive government contract that was already in the pipeline. He asked for $250,000. It was everything Ethan had. The down payment for a house he had been dreaming of, the emergency fund, the painstakingly accumulated stock options. It was his entire adult life, liquidated into a single wire transfer. And then came the knockout punch. The phone call from Ohio. Margaret did not ask Ethan if he was comfortable with this arrangement. She did not ask if this massive financial drain would ruin him. She weaponized her maternal authority, crying hysterically through the receiver, telling Ethan that if he let his brother go bankrupt, the shame would literally kill her. She told him that family sacrifices for family. It is a sick, twisted distortion of loyalty that thrives in the dark corners of American households, where financial boundaries are treated as personal insults. So, Ethan folded. He sat in front of his glowing monitor, listening to the rain beat against the window, and he clicked the button. He watched his net worth drop to a terrifying zero in the blink of an eye, convinced by the hollow promise that Richard would pay him back with 20% interest the moment the new contract was signed. Ethan traded his own future to buy his brother a second chance, not knowing that in the ruthless calculus of a narcissist, a life-saving rescue is rarely remembered as a debt. It is usually rewritten as a weakness to be exploited. The silence that follows a massive financial sacrifice is never immediate. It creeps in slowly, like a subtle drop in barometric pressure before a storm hits the coast. In the first few months after the wire transfer, the illusion of brotherhood remained intact. Richard would call from Austin, his voice practically buzzing with the frantic, caffeinated energy of a man who had just dodged a firing squad. He talked about supply chain logistics, about negotiating with local Texas politicians for tax abatements, about the sleepless nights in his new glass-enclosed office. He was selling Ethan the dream, keeping the investor pacified with carefully curated updates. But if you spend enough time observing human behavior, especially the behavior of desperate men who have suddenly found themselves flush with cash, you start to notice the microscopic shifts in their vocabulary. The pronoun we slowly and methodically gets replaced by the pronoun I. Suddenly, It was no longer about how we saved the company. It was about how I outsmarted the competition, how I secured the new distribution channels. The narrative of the humble, grateful brother was being aggressively rewritten, and Ethan was being edited out of the script. Psychologists call it cognitive dissonance. When a narcissist is forced to accept help, it shatters their self-image as an omnipotent, self-made conqueror. To survive this mental conflict, their brain has to perform a series of Olympic-level gymnastics to diminish the contribution of the person who saved them. They have to convince themselves that they would have survived anyway, that the help was actually insignificant, or worse, that the savior is somehow holding them back. America is a country built on the myth of the self-made titan. We worship the rugged individualist who pulls himself up by his own bootstraps. We put them on magazine covers and beg them for their morning routines. But nobody wants to hear the story of the titan who had to crawl into his little brother's apartment and beg for his life savings. Richard needed to be a titan, which meant Ethan's sacrifice had to be erased from the historical record. The first tangible sign of this erasure arrived in the form of Samantha. If Richard was the salesman, Samantha was the architect of his new reality. She was a powerhouse public relations executive from Dallas, born into old Texas oil money, with a smile that could freeze water. Richard did not just marry her, he merged with her. Samantha understood the ruthless mechanics of the American social hierarchy better than anyone. She looked at Richard's messy, near-bankruptcy past and immediately set to work sanitizing it. She was the one who started managing his social media, replacing the gritty startup struggle posts with polished, high-definition photos of Richard speaking at tech conferences, drinking vintage bourbon on private balconies overlooking the Colorado River, and posing with local senators. She curated a lifestyle that screamed invincibility. I remember analyzing cases like this when I was studying criminal sociology. The most dangerous people are not the ones who break the law with a crowbar. They are the ones who use social conditioning to completely isolate their victims. Samantha was a masterclass in this. She orchestrated a massive family reunion back in Ohio to celebrate Margaret's 65th birthday. It was a spectacle of wealth. Richard and Samantha rented out the entire country club, flying in a private chef and a jazz band. Ethan flew in on a red-eye commercial flight, wearing an off-the-rack suit, his bank account still violently bruised from the loan he had given his brother. When Ethan walked into that ballroom, the dynamic was established immediately. Samantha greeted him with a terrifyingly polite hug, the kind that lasts exactly 1 second too short, and loudly thanked him for taking time out of his little computer job to join them. She spent the entire evening parading Richard around as the undisputed patriarch of the family, the benevolent billionaire who had just paid off their mother's mortgage. When Ethan quietly asked Richard for a private moment to discuss the repayment schedule of his $250,000, Richard barely made eye contact. He patted Ethan on the shoulder, handed him a glass of champagne, and said that the capital was currently tied up in aggressive expansion assets, utilizing words designed specifically to confuse and shut down the conversation. Margaret, intoxicated by the country club setting and the envy of her friends, practically pushed Ethan aside to get a picture with her wealthy, successful eldest son. Ethan was standing in a room full of his own blood, realizing he had paid for the very party he was being ostracized from. But the psychological warfare was merely the smokescreen for a much more sinister reality. The true nature of Richard's betrayal began to unspool when Ethan's own life hit a wall. The tech sector in Seattle experienced a massive, brutal contraction. Algorithms replaced entire departments overnight. Ethan, who had always relied on his quiet competence to keep him safe, was caught in the crossfire of corporate downsizing. He lost his job. The severance package was a joke, barely enough to cover 3 months of rent in one of the most expensive cities in the country. With no emergency fund to fall back on because it was currently sitting in his brother's empire, Ethan panicked. He called Richard. He didn't ask for the full amount. He swallowed his pride and asked for just $20,000. Just enough to keep a roof over his head. While he interviewed for new positions. Uzi. It was a plea for a tiny fraction of his own money back. The response he received was a masterstroke of corporate cruelty. Richard didn't answer the phone. Instead, Ethan received a call from one of Richard's executive assistants, a young, aggressively polite man who informed Ethan that Mr. Richard was currently on a corporate retreat in Aspen and could not be disturbed. The assistant then casually mentioned that if Ethan was experiencing temporary liquidity issues, they could arrange for a low-interest micro-loan through one of their shell companies, provided Ethan signed a standard non-disclosure agreement and a waiver of all previous verbal contracts. Ethan was sitting in his dark apartment, listening to a 20-something assistant offer to loan him his own money at a premium. It was this precise moment of humiliation that finally broke the dam of Ethan's blind loyalty. He reached out to Marcus, a former college roommate who now worked as a forensic accountant in Chicago. Marcus was a cynic, A man whose entire career was built on the premise that rich people lie constantly and the math is the only thing that tells the truth. Ethan gave Marcus the name of Richard's company and asked him to look into their public filings, looking for any sign of the bridge loan, any acknowledgement of the debt. Marcus called back 4 days later, and the tone of his voice was dead serious. He did not ask how Ethan was doing. He simply asked if Ethan had ever signed a convertible note, a promissory document, or any legally binding contract when he transferred the money. Ethan, sick with dread, admitted that he hadn't. That it was a frantic night. That his mother was crying on the phone. That he trusted his own brother. Marcus let out a heavy sigh that sounded like a death sentence. He had pulled the corporate restructuring documents from Delaware, where Richard's company was incorporated for tax purposes. To secure the massive government contract that saved the company, Richard had to pass a rigorous financial audit. Having $250,000 of undocumented personal debt on the books would have terrified the government contractors and killed the deal immediately. So, Richard didn't register the money as a loan. He worked with a team of aggressive corporate lawyers to classify the wire transfer under a very specific, devastating legal loophole. According to the official tax filings, signed and submitted under penalty of perjury, the money was classified as a familial gift. Under federal tax law, a gift requires absolutely no repayment, carries no equity, and permanently strips the giver of any legal right to reclaim the assets. Richard had not just ignored the debt, he had legally sterilized it. He had taken Ethan's life savings, used it to build a multi-million-dollar logistics empire, and effectively washed his hands of the entire transaction with a stroke of a pen. Ethan was not an investor. In the eyes of the law, he was merely a tragic, foolish philanthropist who had handed over his entire future for free. There is a distinct flavor of devastation that comes when you realize the legal system of the United States is not designed to protect the righteous, but rather to shield those who can afford the most creative attorneys. In America, theft is rarely a man in a ski mask kicking down your door in the middle of the night. True, devastating theft happens in brightly lit boardrooms, drafted on high-quality bond paper, and filed quietly with the Internal Revenue Service. When Ethan hung up the phone with Marcus, he did not scream. He did not throw his phone against the wall. He simply sat in the suffocating quiet of his Seattle apartment, listening to the relentless hum of the refrigerator, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. He had been clinically and legally eviscerated. The realization that Richard had deliberately orchestrated this fraud from the very beginning, manipulating their mother's tears to create a smokescreen for a massive financial extraction, shifted Ethan's entire paradigm. It was no longer a story of an ungrateful brother who forgot his roots. It was the story of a predator who had identified the weakest, most loyal member of his own pack and consumed him for capital. The descent into poverty in an American metropolis is shockingly fast. Without the safety net of his savings, and with the severance pay quickly vaporizing in the hyper-inflated economy of the Pacific Northwest, Ethan found himself staring down the barrel of an eviction notice from King County. The tech industry, which had once felt like an impenetrable fortress of job security, was now a barren wasteland of automated rejection emails and ghosted interviews. Ethan sold everything of value: the ergonomic office chair, the dual monitors, the modest collection of vintage vinyl records he had bought to remind him of his father. He watched his life being dismantled and boxed up, piece by piece, until he was left with nothing but his old Honda Civic and a duffel bag of clothes. The nights in Seattle can be brutally damp. A cold that seeps directly into your bones. Sleeping in the passenger seat of a car parked under the glowing sodium lights of a Walmart parking lot forces a man to confront the darkest corners of his own psyche. Ethan lay there, pulling a thin sleeping bag over his shoulders, trying to calculate how a life of playing by the rules, of doing the honorable thing, of sacrificing for his blood, had led him to this concrete bottom. Meanwhile, 2,000 miles away in the sun-drenched, tax-friendly haven of Austin, Texas, Richard was stepping onto a literal pedestal. Samantha's aggressive public relations campaign had culminated in Richard being named Entrepreneur of the Year by a prestigious Southern business journal. The irony was so thick you could choke on it. The magazine feature included a sprawling photo spread of Richard standing in his newly constructed glass and steel headquarters, looking out over the Austin skyline like a conquering emperor. The accompanying article detailed his grueling journey from near bankruptcy to industry titan, heavily emphasizing his rugged self-reliance and his unwavering belief in his own vision. There was an entire paragraph dedicated to his philanthropic efforts, detailing a minor donation he had made to a local youth program. The narrative was bulletproof. The American public was consuming the exact myth they were starved for: the resurrection of the self-made man. Not a single word in the 10-page spread mentioned the $250,000 of his brother's blood money that had acted as the defibrillator for his dying empire. Ethan read that article on a cracked smartphone screen using the free Wi-Fi at a public library, his stomach hollow from eating nothing but cheap canned soup for 3 days. Psychology dictates that a human mind can only process a certain amount of trauma before it either shatters completely or crystallizes into a cold, hardened weapon. Ethan's grief eventually burned itself out, leaving behind a terrifying, absolute clarity. He was not going to vanish quietly into the statistics of the urban homeless. He decided to fight, not just for the money, but for the fundamental assertion that his existence mattered. He spent his last remaining dollars on a bus ticket and a cheap suit from a thrift store, marching himself into the downtown offices of a legal aid clinic that handled civil fraud cases. The attorney he met with was a hardened, cynical woman named Sarah, who had spent decades watching families tear each other apart over inheritances and bad debts. She listened to Ethan's story with a practiced detachment, taking notes on a yellow legal pad. When Ethan finished, expecting a rallying cry of justice, Sarah simply sighed, took off her glasses, and explained the gruesome reality of contract law. Without a signed promissory note, without a documented schedule of repayment, and with the transaction officially recorded as a familial gift in Delaware corporate filings, Ethan's case was essentially non-existent. In civil court, the burden of proof lies heavily on the plaintiff, and verbal agreements made during an emotional family crisis are notoriously impossible to enforce. But Sarah was thorough. She explained that to execute a tax-free gift transfer of that magnitude, especially one that acts as a foundational asset for a corporate entity going through a government audit, the receiving party usually needs an affidavit of gift. The IRS and the SEC look closely at massive influxes of undocumented cash. They require a sworn statement, notarized under penalty of perjury, confirming that the money was given freely, with no expectation of equity or repayment, to prevent money laundering and shadow investing. Sarah requested the public disclosure documents from the state registry. When the file arrived a week later, Ethan was sitting across from her desk, drinking a stale cup of office coffee. Sarah flipped through the heavy stack of legal paper, her eyes scanning the dense legalese, until she stopped abruptly. Her face tightened. She pushed a single sheet of paper across the desk toward Ethan. This was the moment the universe cracked open and swallowed him whole. The document was a standard declaration of financial transfer. But the signature at the bottom, the notarized ink that legally sealed Ethan's fate and officially categorized his life savings as a voluntary, unconditional donation, was not forged by Richard. It was signed by Margaret, his own mother. The betrayal of a sibling is a deep wound, a severing of a shared history. But the betrayal of a mother is an annihilation of the self. In the cold, clinical light of the lawyer's office, the final, horrifying puzzle piece clicked into place. Richard had not just manipulated their mother into pressuring Ethan for the money. Richard had used Margaret as his legal shield. When the corporate auditors demanded proof that the $250,000 was not a hidden liability, Richard knew he could never get Ethan to sign away his rights to the money. So, he went to the one person who worshipped him enough to commit perjury on his behalf. Margaret, acting as the matriarch and the supposed mediator of the family's finances, had signed a sworn affidavit, stating that she had overseen the transfer, and that it was a collective family decision to gift the money to Richard to secure the family legacy. She had walked into a notary public in Ohio, presented her driver's license, raised her right hand, and legally signed away her youngest son's entire future. The psychological implications of this act are almost too grotesque to unpack. It requires a complete dehumanization of the scapegoat child. Margaret did not just favor Richard, she viewed Ethan as a resource, a battery to be drained to keep her golden child shining. She had rationalized the theft. In her twisted, narcissistic worldview, Richard's success was her success. Richard's wealth elevated her social standing at the country club, bought her a new house, and validated her entire existence as a mother. Ethan's financial ruin was simply collateral damage, a necessary sacrifice on the altar of Richard's greatness. She had likely convinced herself that since Ethan was used to living a quiet, frugal life, he did not really need the money anyway. Or worse, she simply did not care. She had traded her youngest son's safety, his home, and his sanity for a front row seat to her eldest son's fabricated glory. Ethan stared at the signature, the familiar loops and curves of his mother's handwriting, the same handwriting that had signed his birthday cards, that had written sick notes for him in elementary school, was now the weapon used to execute his financial murder. There was no anger left in him. Anger requires hope, a belief that an injustice has occurred and can be rectified. What Ethan felt was a profound, cosmic emptiness. The foundation of his reality, the belief that a mother inherently protects her young, was completely obliterated. He realized that for his entire life, he had been trying to earn the love of a woman who viewed him only as spare parts for the son she actually wanted. He had sacrificed his dreams to save a brother who viewed him as prey, and he had been betrayed by the mother who held the knife. He walked out of the law office, stepping onto the rain-slicked pavement of downtown Seattle, completely unmoored from the human race, carrying a truth so heavy it threatened to pull him down to the center of the earth. There is a very specific, terrifying kind of freedom that comes from losing absolutely everything. I have sat across the microphone from inmates on death row, from disgraced politicians, from men who watched their empires burn to ashes, and they all describe the exact same psychological phenomenon. When the final thread connecting you to society snaps, when your credit score is pulverized, when your address is reduced to the license plate number of a Honda Civic, the fear of consequences completely evaporates. Society controls us through the threat of loss. We behave because we are terrified of losing our jobs, our homes, our reputations, and the love of our families. But what happens when the people you love have already gutted you? What happens when the system has already legally sanctioned your ruin? You stop playing by their rules. Ethan did not drive his car into the Pacific Ocean. He did not surrender. Instead, he spent his last $40 filling up his gas tank, pointed his car east, and began a grueling, 3-day drive across the American continent, heading straight for the rusted heart of Ohio. Driving across America when you are destitute is a profound exercise in existential dread. Ethan drove past the hollowed-out manufacturing towns of the Midwest, places where the American dream had been packed up and shipped overseas decades ago. He saw the reflection of his own life in those empty storefronts and crumbling factories. He had operated on the assumption that hard work and familial loyalty were the bedrock of a good life. He was wrong. The bedrock of the modern American success story is often built on the bones of the people who trusted you the most. Ethan had 3 days of staring at the endless white lines of the interstate to process the magnitude of his mother's betrayal. He analyzed every memory, every childhood interaction, realizing that Margaret had never actually loved Richard more than him. Margaret only loved herself. Richard was simply the avatar she used to project her own ego into the world. Richard was the winner, the champion, the billionaire, which made Margaret the mother of the champion. Ethan was just collateral damage, a piece of wood thrown into the furnace to keep the train moving. He arrived in Ohio on the third Thursday of November. Thanksgiving Day. The holiest of American holidays. A day dedicated to the performative display of family unity and gratitude. Margaret's new house, paid for entirely by Richard's corporate accounts, sat at the end of a private cul-de-sac in one of the wealthiest suburbs of Columbus. It was a sprawling, faux colonial mansion with manicured lawns and a driveway packed with luxury SUVs. Through the massive bay windows, Ethan could see the warm, golden glow of chandeliers and the bustling movement of his extended family. Uncles, aunts, cousins, people who had ignored him for years, were all gathered around carrying expensive bottles of wine, laughing, basking in the manufactured glory of the family's golden child. Ethan sat in his freezing car for an hour, watching the spectacle. He was wearing the same clothes he had slept in for a week. His face was hollow, his eyes sunken, his posture bent under the weight of his reality. But inside his jacket pocket was a manila envelope containing the copied legal documents from the Delaware Corporate Registry. When Ethan pushed open the heavy oak front door and stepped into the grand foyer, the laughter in the house died a sudden, violent death. The psychology of a family system built on a lie is incredibly fragile. They all knew, on some subconscious level, that Ethan was the sacrificial lamb that paid for this house, for this party, for Richard's private jets. Seeing the physical manifestation of their collective guilt standing in the doorway, smelling of stale car upholstery and cheap coffee, was deeply offensive to their curated reality. Margaret was the first to react. She walked out of the kitchen, wearing a cashmere sweater and pearls, holding a crystal wine glass. Her face instantly contorted into a mask of aggressive victimhood. She did not ask Ethan how he was. She did not ask why he looked so terribly thin. She immediately hissed at him, asking him how dare he show up unannounced and ruin the holiday. She told him he was embarrassing the family. Richard materialized from the living room, holding a tumbler of expensive bourbon, wearing a custom-fitted tailored vest. He put on the patronizing, corporate voice he used to terminate lower-level employees. He told Ethan that this was neither the time nor the place, that if he needed financial assistance they could have human resources set up an appointment next week. He reached into his pocket, pulled out a thick wad of cash, and tried to press it into Ethan's chest, telling him to go get a hotel room and clean himself up. It was the ultimate display of dominance. The billionaire tossing scraps to the beggar he had created. Ethan let the cash hit the hardwood floor. He did not raise his voice. He did not throw a punch. He simply walked past Richard, walked past his horrified mother, and went straight into the formal dining room where the massive, catered turkey sat untouched on a silver platter. The entire extended family followed him in dead silence. Ethan stood at the head of the table, slowly unbuttoned his jacket, and pulled out the manila envelope. I want to pause here and dissect this moment from a sociological perspective. In Western culture, the dining table is the ultimate theater of family politics. It is where hierarchies are established and enforced. By taking the head of the table, Ethan was actively dismantling the power dynamic. He laid the documents out on the pristine white tablecloth. He looked directly at Margaret and asked her, in a voice as cold and flat as a frozen lake, how much her soul cost. Margaret began to stammer, playing the fragile elderly woman, looking around the room for defenders. But Ethan did not let her breathe. He picked up the affidavit of gift. He read it aloud. He read the exact legal phrasing where Margaret, under oath, swore to the United States government that Ethan's $250,000 was a collective family donation. He read the notary stamp. He read her signature. The silence in the dining room became suffocating. The uncles and aunts, who had been worshipping Richard just moments ago, suddenly shifted their gazes to the floor. The undeniable proof of a mother legally orchestrating the financial ruin of her own son was too grotesque even for a family accustomed to looking the other way. Richard tried to interrupt, launching into a frantic, aggressive monologue about corporate tax strategy and how Ethan simply did not understand the complexities of venture capitalism. He tried to gaslight the entire room, claiming the documents were out of context, that he had always intended to pay Ethan back outside the books. But then, a voice cut through the air that nobody expected. It was Samantha, Richard's wife, the public relations shark. She was standing by the doorway, her arms crossed, her eyes completely devoid of warmth. She looked at Richard, with a mixture of absolute disgust and terrifying calculation. You see, a woman like Samantha does not marry a man. She merges with a balance sheet. And when the balance sheet becomes toxic, she liquidates her position. Samantha walked into the room, poured herself a glass of water, and dropped the ultimate, devastating truth that changed the entire trajectory of Ethan's life. She looked at Ethan and told him that losing his money was the luckiest thing that had ever happened to him. The room froze. Richard's face turned the color of ash. He lunged forward to grab Samantha's arm. But she slapped his hand away with vicious precision. Samantha revealed that Richard's entire logistics empire was a mirage. The massive government contracts were real, but the way Richard had fulfilled them was not. For the past 3 years, Richard had been artificially inflating his revenue sheets, running a highly sophisticated corporate Ponzi scheme by moving non-existent freight between shell companies to secure larger and larger lines of federal credit. The bubble had burst. The Securities and Exchange Commission, along with the Federal Bureau of Investigation, had been quietly building a massive wire fraud and racketeering case against Richard for the past 8 months. The grand jury indictments were already sealed. The raids were scheduled for the end of the year. Richard was not a billionaire genius. He was a dead man walking, facing up to 25 years in a federal penitentiary. But that was not the truth that broke Margaret. The truth that brought the mother to her knees was the mechanics of how Richard had structured his fraud. Samantha, immune to the sentimentality of family ties, laid it out with surgical cruelty. When Richard forced Margaret to sign that affidavit claiming Ethan's money was a gift, he did not just use it to clear his initial audit. He used that specific legal document, and Margaret's signature, to establish the foundational shell company that laundered the fake revenue. By making Margaret the legally registered agent of that initial seed money, Richard had strategically built a firewall between himself and the federal government. He had essentially positioned his own mother as the primary beneficiary and legal architect of the financial fraud. Samantha looked down at Margaret, who was now hyperventilating, clutching the edge of the dining table so hard her knuckles were white. Samantha explained that when the federal agents kick down the doors, they are going to trace the inception of the fraudulent enterprise directly back to that sworn affidavit. Richard had not just stolen Ethan's money, he had meticulously and deliberately framed his own mother to take the fall for a multi-million-dollar federal crime. He traded her freedom for a few extra years of flying private. Margaret looked up at Richard, her golden boy, the son she had sacrificed her own flesh and blood to protect. Richard could not look her in the eye. He stared at the wall, a hollow, pathetic shell of a man, stripped of his PR armor, exposed as a cowardly predator who would consume his own mother to survive. Then Samantha turned to Ethan. She explained the bitter irony of his situation. If Richard had accepted the money as a loan, if he had given Ethan equity or placed him on the board of directors like he originally promised, Ethan would be legally tied to the fraudulent enterprise. As an investor and a board member, the federal government would have seized Ethan's remaining assets, dragged him through years of criminal litigation, and potentially indicted him as a co-conspirator. But because Richard was so unspeakably greedy, because Margaret was so entirely devoid of maternal instinct that she legally severed Ethan from the transaction to steal from him, they had completely insulated him from the blast zone. By legally declaring the money a gift and writing Ethan entirely out of the corporate history, they had accidentally built an impenetrable legal wall around him. The federal government had no jurisdiction over a man who had been legally robbed and discarded. Ethan stood in the silent dining room, looking at the two people who had destroyed his life. His mother was sobbing hysterically on the floor, realizing that the mansion she was sitting in was bought with dirty money and that she would likely spend her final years in a federal medical facility wearing a jumpsuit. His brother was pacing the room like a cornered animal, frantically trying to dial his lawyers who had likely already abandoned him. Ethan realized he did not need to scream. He did not need to demand an apology. The universe, in its dark, twisted, deeply American sense of justice, had already executed a sentence far worse than anything Ethan could have designed. His revenge was not an action. It was his sheer, legally protected survival. He slowly gathered the Delaware corporate documents, slid them back into the manila envelope, and zipped up his worn-out jacket. He walked out of the house, leaving the front door wide open, stepping out into the freezing Ohio night, finally breathing the clean, sharp air of a man who had escaped a burning building right before the roof collapsed. The drive away from the affluent suburbs of Columbus felt like breaking the gravitational pull of a dying star. For the first time in his entire adult life, Ethan was not navigating the crushing expectations of his mother or the suffocating shadow of his brother. He was driving a 10-year-old car with a failing transmission and an empty bank account, yet he possessed a profound, untouchable wealth that the people inside that mansion would never understand. He had his reality back. In the field of human psychology, there is a concept known as the trauma bond. It is a deeply physiological addiction to the cycle of abuse, where the victim becomes biologically dependent on the intermittent validation of their abuser. For 32 years, Ethan had been locked inside a trauma bond masquerading as the American family ideal. He had been conditioned to believe that his suffering was the currency required to buy his mother's affection and his brother's respect. But as the freezing November wind howled through the cracked window of his Honda Civic, the psychological chain snapped. He did not feel the need to rescue anyone anymore. He did not have to pretend that the people who shared his DNA were inherently good. The devastating truth had set him free, leaving him entirely bankrupt but utterly, completely clean. The implosion of Richard's empire did not happen overnight, but when it finally collapsed, it was a spectacle of absolute, devastating corporate carnage. The Federal Bureau of Investigation does not operate with the dramatic flair of a television show. They operate with the cold, suffocating efficiency of a python. In late January, just 2 months after that catastrophic Thanksgiving dinner, a fleet of black sport utility vehicles silently surrounded the glass and steel headquarters of Richard's logistics company in downtown Austin. There were no warning calls. There was no time for lawyers to shred documents. The federal agents seized the servers, froze the offshore accounts, and marched Richard out of the building in handcuffs right as the morning commuters were sipping their expensive lattes. The very media outlets that had crowned him Entrepreneur of the Year just a few months prior immediately pivoted to feast on his carcass. The narrative flipped from the triumphant self-made man to the greedy, predatory sociopath. Richard's face was plastered across every financial news network, stripped of his tailored suits and PR-trained smile, looking bloated, terrified, and small. But the federal indictments revealed a much darker, far more tragic reality for the family left behind in Ohio. Samantha, the brilliant and ruthless architect of Richard's public image, had executed her exit strategy flawlessly. Long before the raid, she had quietly approached the Securities and Exchange Commission, trading thousands of pages of internal communications and encrypted emails in exchange for absolute federal immunity. She walked away from the wreckage without a single scratch on her reputation, filing for divorce the day Richard was arraigned and disappearing into the wealthy enclaves of Europe. She left the ultimate, inescapable legal burden squarely on the shoulders of the one person foolish enough to trust Richard unconditionally. Margaret. Because Margaret had signed that notarized affidavit, swearing under penalty of perjury that the foundational seed money of the fraudulent enterprise was a personal gift she managed, the Department of Justice officially listed her as a co-conspirator in the racketeering charges. The federal government does not care about maternal devotion, they care about paper trails. When the prosecutors moved to seize assets purchased with laundered money, they did not just take Richard's private jet and his penthouse, they took the sprawling faux colonial mansion in Ohio. They took Margaret's pension. They took every single piece of jewelry, every luxury car, and every country club membership. The irony was a bitter, poisonous pill. The very woman who had gladly sacrificed her youngest son to secure her position in the social elite was now publicly disgraced, indicted for federal wire fraud, and entirely abandoned by the wealthy friends she had fought so hard to impress. Margaret was forced to move into a tiny, state-funded assisted living facility pending her criminal trial, waiting for letters from a golden child who was now sitting in a maximum security federal penitentiary facing a 20-year sentence. Richard never wrote to her. A narcissist stripped of his resources has no use for the people who can no longer feed his ego. Meanwhile, a quiet resurrection was taking place on the ragged edge of the Pacific Northwest. Ethan did not return to the hyper-competitive, soul-crushing tech sector of Seattle. He drove west, pushing his dying car until he hit the Pacific Ocean, settling in a small, working-class fishing town on the coast of Oregon. He found a job working the overnight shift at a local marine supply warehouse, doing inventory and maintaining their basic computer systems. It was a job that paid a fraction of his former salary, a job that Richard and Margaret would have undoubtedly considered a pathetic failure. But for Ethan, it was a sanctuary. The warehouse smelled of salt, motor oil, and wet pine. The people he worked with did not speak in corporate buzzwords, they did not care about venture capital or social status, and most importantly, they meant exactly what they said. Recovery from profound family trauma is never a cinematic montage. It is a slow, grueling process of unlearning decades of toxic conditioning. There were nights when Ethan would wake up in a cold sweat on his cheap mattress, his heart pounding, the phantom guilt of abandoning his family threatening to drag him back into the abyss. There is a pervasive, deeply damaging narrative in American culture that insists you must forgive your abusers in order to heal. That blood is thicker than water, and that cutting off your family is a moral failure. But as Ethan watched the violent winter storms batter the Oregon coast, he realized the ultimate truth about forgiveness. You do not have to forgive the people who tried to destroy you. You do not owe absolution to a predator simply because you shared a childhood home. True healing does not come from reconciliation. It comes from radical acceptance. Ethan accepted that his mother and brother were fundamentally broken people, incapable of the unconditional love he had spent his entire life trying to earn. By letting go of the desperate hope that they would one day change, he reclaimed the energy they had been siphoning from him for 30 years. He slowly built a new life, entirely on his own terms. He bought a small, rusted fishing skiff and spent his weekends out on the water, surrounded by the deafening silence of the ocean. He adopted a stray dog that wandered into the warehouse parking lot, finding more loyalty and genuine connection in an abandoned animal than he had ever experienced in his own bloodline. He started reading philosophy, studying the Stoics, understanding that a man's worth is not defined by his investment portfolio or his ability to tolerate abuse, but by the quiet integrity of his daily actions. He was no longer the sacrificial lamb of the family. He was just Ethan, a man who had walked through the fire, lost absolutely everything, and discovered that the ashes left behind were the perfect foundation to build a life of genuine peace. Sometimes, the universe delivers justice in the form of a thunderbolt. But more often than not, justice is simply the privilege of walking away while the people who wronged you drown in the consequences of their own making. Ethan lost $250,000, but he bought his soul back from the devil. And in the ruthless, transactional landscape of the modern American dream, that is the greatest bargain a man could ever strike. This is Tom Hallen, and you have been listening to the stark, unfiltered reality of the human condition. The stories we tell ourselves about family are powerful. But they should never be a suicide pact. If you are sitting in the dark right now, setting yourself on fire just to keep your abusers warm, I want you to look at the door. You always have the right to walk through it. Thank you for tuning in tonight, folks. If this story resonated with you, if it made you question the invisible chains in your own life, make sure you hit that subscribe button, leave a review, and share this podcast with someone who might need to hear it. Stay sharp, stay honest, and above all else, protect your peace. Good night, America.